But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a sense of what it means when I say that my subtitle, which Liam had, was Science in the Backwaters, Competition and Community. And I'm going to start off with some India-specific descriptions of what it is like and what it means to do science in India, how it has changed over the past 30 years that I have known science in India as a student and then as a faculty member. And I'm going to make some arguments both about the obvious limitations that you will see as I go along, and about the paradoxical advantages that such a manifestly suboptimal situation generates. And I will end with some random thoughts, or at least semi-random thoughts, I hope, about what in such a situation competition and community mean within the doers of science. The competition as in the equivalent of currently, what, 12%, 12th percentile NIH funding, and community in the sense of this particular ongoing meeting, in which I hope people worry about how we are going to have fun together rather than separately in each in our own solipsistic little universe. So let me start with India. 30 years ago, here's what India was like as far as the doing of science was concerned. There were a large number, or at least what felt to a student like large numbers, of research institutions that were and still are called national laboratories. And these are institutions, freestanding institutions, that are autonomous but publicly funded by the union government, the federal government equivalent. And these institutions had faculty members whose primary job description was research. There were universities, there still are universities, there are 300 plus universities in India. However, research in universities has, certainly in the biological sciences with which I'm familiar, has never been particularly notable. There are a number of reasons for that we can get into if anybody would like to. But suffice it to say for the moment that the average grant size for extramural grants in research institutions was maybe $2,000 a year, maybe $3,000 a year. This, as you can imagine, wasn't a great deal of money. Now, how easy was it to get funding? And the answer is it was extremely difficult. Like most traditional, particularly post-colonial communities, India was and still is very hierarchical in its social structures, and science is no exception. So you had what was effectively a whole clutch of godfathers, mostly godfathers, very few, if to none, godmothers. And it didn't matter how good a grant you wrote. If you didn't have a godfather, you didn't get the grant, pretty much. I exaggerate a little, but not very much. The third issue was that grants were expected to be written and to claim to create solutions for India-specific problems, to create in the biomedical sciences and in the biomedicine-related life sciences, India-specific solutions for health and disease-related problems, in the plant sciences to create solutions for agriculture-related problems. All of this created a situation where very small money was being spent in small laboratories, small groups, and relatively so-called applied stuff was being done. People still did interesting and respectable science. And if you did a sort of output per dollar calculation crudely, it wasn't bad. Over the past 20 years, this situation has changed quite dramatically. I came back to India in 91, and already there was a little bit of change from the situation that I knew 10 years earlier when I'd been a student. And over the 90s, two major changes took place. The first one was that you still could write a terrible grant and get it funded if you had godfathers. But for the first time in my experience, if you wrote a respectable grant, and I don't mean an outstanding, stellar 1.1 NIH score grant, I mean sort of a grant that everybody follows, everybody says, oh yes, these are worthwhile experiments to do. If you wrote that kind of grant, you didn't need a godfather. You got funding. The second thing was that you didn't get $2,000 any longer. This had gone up, and by the end of the 90s, it was up to about $10,000 a year. Currently, it's about an average grant size is between $10,000 to $20,000 a year. This meant that you got a little bit of money. I can see that that would sound like terribly small potatoes. However, Indian extramural grants don't typically require you to bring in salaries because salaries are paid for by institutions. They typically don't require you to bring in a number of other pressing issues such as, and I suspect some part of the audience will find resonance with this, such as mouse costs, which are covered by institutions. So there's a fair amount of leeway. You don't need to find grad student salaries. You don't need to find, most times, postdoc salaries. And even when you do, the salaries are low enough that it really isn't a major issue. So typically, grad student postdoc salaries range between $300 to $500 a month. So even if you need to cover one, that's not a major issue. Anyway, so that was the second thing that changed. But the third thing that changed was that people began worrying a little less. Funding agencies and study section equivalent committees began worrying a little less about whether this grant addressed an India-specific problem or not, and began worrying about whether output from that investigator, and if that investigator was a young investigator from her time as a postdoc, and if that investigator was an established one from their earlier work, whether that investigator had been interestingly productive with at least some reasonable level of international publication-related visibility. All of this was the 90s. What has happened over this past decade is that funding for science has steadily increased. Remember, grant sizes have not increased enormously, although they have gone up significantly, but not monumentally so. But funding has increased to the point that over this past decade, new institutions in science have, compared to earlier years, proliferated in the country. There are still new institutions being developed. And for the first time, there is an actual debate in the country about how we can use the funding available for science in the creation of new organizational structures, rather than simply saying, can we just get a little bit more money on each grant, which is sort of the basic thing that you'd ask for in a state of extreme poverty. In all of this, there are certain things that haven't changed in the actual doing of science. So if I order a reagent from Sigma today, it still takes me at least a month to get the reagent. Sometimes it takes me as much as 3 months. If I want a bunch of mice from the Jackson lab, it takes me a year of sweat and blood and government forms in quadruplicate, both here and in the United States. And while this has improved a little bit, it hasn't obviously come anywhere near what you folks have. Grant sizes are still not as big anywhere near, uh, despite all the caveats I offered, as they could be. Um, Graduate students are where India's labs get most of their work done from. India doesn't have postdoc cultures because if there are any Indian origin postdocs in the audience, they will appreciate that it's far more attractive to go west and to be a postdoc there than to be a postdoc in India. In consequence, it's far easier to run, it's the only realistic way in India is to run labs that are primarily grad student labs. However, unlike in at least some parts of the West, um, graduate students in India, incoming graduate students, don't come in with any real hands-on wet work laboratory experience. So they inevitably spend a fair amount of time discovering themselves, discovering their feet in the lab, tripping over their feet, and all the inevitable consequences thereof. None of this, you would think, is contributory to high levels of productivity. And yet, if you think about it, over these past 2 decades, India's done certainly better in the life sciences than it did, for example, in the 20 years before that. So clearly, some things have changed for the good. But that's more general. More specifically, here's the argument that I would dearly like to make, which is that there are peculiar and unexpected advantages of doing science in India. So what do I mean by advantages? And here's what I mean. As I said, today in India, it's true that if you write a merely competent grant, a grant that's sound in its science, and that asks a question that's technically feasible, but it's a question that's not humongously exciting, you will get funded. Now, you don't stand a snowflake's chance in hell of getting that kind of a grant funded in the US. Certainly not from the NIH, and probably not from the NSF, although who knows with recent funding. However, here's what happens in India. Because of the situation, which is that if you're faculty in India, your salary is fixed, you don't negotiate salaries, your promotions are reasonably fixed, so you have no real incentives or disincentives to do or not do work, and there are enough disadvantages to struggling for doing work that many people don't. Tenure is not a terribly serious issue still in most Indian institutions, although there are exceptions. As a result, there is a fairly large pool of below average, mediocre people doing small amounts of science. In this background, with the kind of funding that's currently available, getting good grants funded is not difficult at all. Getting slightly above grants funded is not difficult at all. And therefore, if you have a really interesting and a really high-risk idea, the kind of idea that the NIH needs to create special, what are they called? Director's special funds to support in desperation, because most study sections will tend to begin to narrow down grants into a focused rut. Those grants and those ideas will be funded like that in India. You don't need to fight for it. You don't need to worry about it. You only need to have the courage and the imagination to think about it and to ask for the money. And you will get it. A very large number of people who do good science, good life sciences, again, I should restrict myself to that, good life science in India, get funded like that with grants that wouldn't get funded anywhere else. Not because they are bad grants, but because they're risky grants. The ability to take these risks is a peculiar and enormous advantage created as a consequence of India's backwater situation. And I don't know how many people would agree, and I'm willing to argue about this, but I suggest to you that a major failure of the intensely competitive model of doing and funding science is the ability to take very large risks for relatively small people. If you're, if, you know, if you're Liz Blackburn, you can take risks, sure, you'll be funded. Um, you're not going to be funded if you've been an assistant professor for a year and you woke up one night and said, oh my goodness, that's so simple, it has to be true, but I don't have the data, I don't have the preliminary evidence. And I think that we have, in the competitive model of science, we have suppressed that possibility to our cost. And I think that backwater situations such as India's enables the funding and the flourishing of those ideas. What it needs is for Indian institutions to be discriminating about choosing people who are likely to have really good ideas of that kind. That's not as simple as it sounds, of course not. And who can tell what kind of a faculty member an outstanding postdoc might morph into? Nonetheless, that's a huge advantage that I think India provides for what I'm calling striking a balance between science as competition and science as open space communities. And I think that that's something worth thinking about. Apropos of this, there are a couple of specific issues that it might be worthwhile to point out. So how are Indian grants funded? Typically, here's what happens. I'm sort of providing, please remember, an idealized and interpreted narrative. This is not necessarily exactly how it happens. But by and large, most Indian funding agency representatives will tell you that Indian extramural grants are extremely competitive. We fund at about 15 to 20% of all grants funded. This is true. What's unstated is that very many grants are incomprehensible and therefore go out of the window at first reading because they are simply technically so bad that there's no question of even discussing. Apart from those, and those are a very large number, apart from those, if you look at the grants that remain, most grants will get some level of funding. However, all grants will not get the entire happily wishful level of funding that they want. In effect, what happens frequently as an outcome, as an emergent property, mind you, not necessarily as an intentional design, is that the outstanding grants, of course, get funded at whatever level they've asked for. The less exciting a grant is, the more likely it is to have its funding trimmed, and the most boring grants, I'm aware that I'm doing some injustice to many people who write sound but boring grants, but nonetheless, the most boring grants, which are nonetheless technically sound, they come from small universities, where money for providing hands-on experience to students would be extremely useful and valuable, and for a variety of reasons, therefore, some level of funding is provided. And I have seen in many instances this low level of funding eventually transforming future research grants with small amounts of data into significantly and distinctly better proposals. What this allows as a model, I'm not suggesting that this entire thing be held as a model. All said and done, nobody really wants to argue that mediocrity amongst the scientific community be the rule. But what it allows as a model is to say the winner take all model of either electoral politics or science funding may not be the greatest model ever. We might want to consider a science funding equivalent of proportionate representation. And I think that this was not something that I had thought about, certainly not in these terms, prior to my 2 decades of hard knocks experience in doing science in India. The other thing about doing science in India is, as I said, that you don't really negotiate salaries. So you don't really have any terrible incentives to try to do outstanding research or high visibility research. What that does is create a situation where the people who are most actively doing research, most people will try to do something kind of sort of to chug in place. But the people who most actively do research are therefore internally driven. They're driven as a matter of individual choices rather than being driven as a consequence of, oh shit, forgive me, but I have to make tenure. I absolutely have to make tenure. You don't worry about it. And if you don't have to worry about it that much, the people who, it turns out that the people who do outstanding work are most people who are interested in the questions for the sake of the question, rather than whether that question is a fundable question or not. And I think that that makes a qualitative difference to the kind of science that is done at the rare, low-frequency top end of, certainly of life science in India. And I think that that's a second, and I think very large gain of doing science in the backwaters. A little personal note. 20 years ago, when I came back to India, I came to an institution which was called the National Institute of Immunology, but I discovered that very few faculty members were actually doing classical immunology, for reasons that it would take too long to describe. In any case, it turned out that there was really one person, a faculty member who joined months before me, who was also interested in doing classical immunology. And we talked about it, and we decided that rather than working as micro labs doing immunology in a whole sea of biochemists, structural biologists, we may as well run a joint lab. So effectively, despite the fact that we were independent investigators, we've over these past 2 decades run a joint lab. We hold joint group meetings, all research projects are held in common, all publications are done together. As a matter of fact, currently there are 3 people in the group, 3 PIs in the group. When we began doing this, people in India said, why on earth are you doing this? And we said, is there a problem with it? And I was expecting to be told that if I were in the US, you guys wouldn't make tenure, you guys wouldn't make grants properly, and so on and so forth. But none of that was an issue. So all that turned out people were going to tell us was that you're not going to get the prizes. It's been okay without prizes. So really, you don't need to fight for your own credit. You can do it as groups. Everything that I have done over these past 2 decades, all bits and pieces of science, has been as part of a collegial group that includes immunologists like myself, that includes cell biologists, that includes molecular and structural biologists, that includes virologists, that includes a whole slew of people, not in a project-by-project collaboration, but in long-term collaboration where even when we're not publishing together, we're talking about our science to each other together. And I think that that is yet another space for community created in the backwaters that India stands for and represents. There are other issues that are more general that it would have been nice to talk about, and if I had been present there physically, I would have. But they are not India specific. They are to do with why we do science, and you might want to think about a little school kids experiment. Certainly in India this is true. I suspect it's true in the US. You ask children in school what they think about when you say science, and they talk about physics and chemistry and biology, and then you turn around and say, but I thought you had a textbook called social science. And they say, yeah. And you say, oh, don't you think of any of that when you think about science? And they don't. And it's worthwhile for us when we talk about competition and community and the purpose of doing science to think about why, as a society, when we think about science, we only think about the natural sciences and not the social sciences. As I said, I have arguments about this that I would have been happy to talk about if I were there, but that's not India specific. And I've set myself this limit because of Skype of staying India specific. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very glad to answer questions. Thanks.
So for questions, they have to all be addressed to one of those two standing mics, or else we won't be able to hear you. And I don't think I can rotate the computer around. Actually, maybe this will
work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. So my name is Carlos, and I'm a grad student at UCSF, but I'm originally from Brazil. And I mean, from what you said, I feel like at least the funding in Brazil is to a large extent similar to the conditions in India. And one of the things that I think are interesting on, like when you're doing science in a constrained environment, either if it's constrained by funding or other things, is that, I mean, ideas in a way they're cheap, right? I mean, if you have good ideas, it's fine, but to get them done is like the hard thing. And the question, like the specific thing I'd like to ask is that, like when limitations with funding, like often what that reflects into is like technological limitations, right? Often you really don't have the right piece of equipment to answer the specific question you want to answer. But that does not mean that you can't answer interesting questions within the context of your lab and the resources that you have. I was just wondering what are your thoughts into how that affects the type of science done in India or is it a general thing? And also like how can you train people to perform optimally in an environment where they're going to be constrained in some way, be that by money or technology or other things?
Okay. I think I heard all of that. So let me break that up in the answer into two parts. One part is the question of, is there a, if I may restate the question, is there a collegial critical mass for you of people working in the general area that you work in so that you can bounce ideas off them, so that you can talk to them, so that you have a community to talk to? The answer to that is that you don't, but that things are better today than they were 20 years ago, quite substantially better today, particularly because people within India tend to talk to each other regardless of which institution they belong to. And therefore, going back and forth between cities, between institutions, as your peer group for casual conversations, not formal consultations, is very much the norm. Nonetheless, the limitation that for any working discipline within biology, the critical mass is relatively non-existent, still remains reality, and I am told by friends in Brazil that that's the case, and so it wouldn't surprise me if there were stark similarities there. The second component of the question is about instrumentation and whether the kind of resources that you need, not simply in terms of money, but in terms of instruments and specialized expertise to do the experiments, is available or not. And on that one, 20 years ago, I would have said that the answer is only an extremely lukewarm yes. Today, it's really not difficult at all to get access to instrumentation in meaningful fashion, meaning to get access to instrumentation with real and substantive and organized help in getting the experiments done if you don't know how to use the instruments yourself. Most people in the national laboratories where the bulk of life science research is done will, in fact, have access already to almost any high-end instrumentation you care to name. But that's been true only over these past, not even a decade, about 5 or 6 years, I would say. And I don't know what the Brazilian situation in that context is, but in India, that's certainly been a large part of the guarded and skeptical optimism that people like me have about doing science. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yes.
Hi, you described that 15 to 20 years ago that the Indian granting system was kind of ruled by godfathers. And now you, according to your description, it sounds like the Indian granting system works in many ways better than the one we have in the United States. What do you attribute to the demise of the godfather system and the arisal of a functioning, modest granting system in your country?
Okay. So in the first place, no, it does not work better than it does in the United States.
Okay.
So let me underline.
USA.
Let me underline the points on which the Indian system is an absolute failure. There are no grant cycles. There are no grant deadlines. Therefore, you're never quite certain of when your grant will be considered, when funding will come through if you get it, and this becomes a huge and enormous mess. So no, there is much more to fix, and many of us fight and quarrel and make a noise about it all the time. On the other hand, it is true that in some respects, as I described, it feels to me more like a proportionate representation system rather than a winner-take-all system, albeit as an emergent property, mind you, rather than intentional prior design. But let me clarify something. It is not my case that the godfathers have undergone spontaneous combustion. They haven't. Godfatherliness and increasingly godmotherliness is a consequence of societal culture. That's not simply to do with science. That comes from where we come from into science. And in traditional feudal, as I said, to an extent, post-colonial angst-ridden communities and cultures and societies. Are there any Canadians in the audience? They'll know about what post-colonial means.
So do we, sort of.
So, godfatherliness is an attribute that does not go away. So, as I said, if you write a terrifyingly rotten grant and you are yourself amongst the godfathers or very closely identified with one, what are the odds that your grant will at least be seriously considered and perhaps even funded? They're pretty big. So it's not at all my case that the system has undergone demise. What has happened again is that in the eddies and the turbulence, a small space has been created, in part because there is actually a fair amount of funding available for non-godfathered grants that are clearly sound and respectable, not exciting, mind you, but just respectable, to be funded, albeit at modest levels. And that transition has happened, as I said, in part because there is a fair amount of funding, in part because grant pressure is relatively low because although faculty members, if you count universities and colleges, is huge, there is really no pressure on everybody to be doing research and putting in large numbers of grants. And in part because grant sizes themselves, average grant sizes, are small. With all of that, there is enough space created that an extra Godfather-driven funding space for grants becomes available.
Thank you very much.
So my question is, building upon something you mentioned to Chris, is about the reflection of social changes inside of the science culture. There is great gender inequity in science in India, and I'm wondering how if that's changing at all, and to build upon
I'm
that.
sorry, could you just say that sentence again?
There's gender inequity in India across genres. Is science changing that at all? Is it an agent of change in terms of gender equity? And secondly, are we seeing socioeconomic change in terms of people that are what you would consider poor? Are they given opportunities to elevate in the science community in India as well?
Right. Okay, so the first question of gender equity. The short answer is no, India doesn't do particularly well even today in terms of gender equity. On the other hand, is it better than 20 years ago? Yes, it's hugely better than 20 years ago. So here's the problem. Of the incoming graduate student class in the institute where I work, of a class of anything between 30 to 40, certainly 60% are women. And yet, amongst my faculty colleagues out of 45, only about 10 are women. This is across institutions, by and large, this is true. In fact, my institute is probably one of the more gender diverse ones. But more than simply faculty positions, as with the US, although this Nobel Prize is a particularly bad year to say that in, but as in the US, it's the high-end glass ceiling that has proven extremely resistant to change. In other words, heads of department, chairs of divisions, directors of institutions, extremely small numbers are women. And that's really where a huge barrier still exists. At the level of entry-level faculty recruitment, at the level of assistant professors, I'm inclined to argue that there is still a barrier, but I will also admit that that's a much weaker barrier than it was 20 years ago. Remember that the requirements for gender-specific family responsibilities in India are culturally even more demanding than they are in the West, and therefore it shouldn't surprise any of us if large numbers of women, even after completing their doctoral degrees, choose to take high school teaching jobs or choose to take relatively low-level industry jobs, or just in occasional instances, choose to stay as homemakers. The issue of socioeconomic disparities and whether socioeconomic disparities have been addressed in inclusiveness within the praxis of science, if I understood that question correctly. Again, the short answer is no. India and scientists in India as a community are still the equivalent of WASPs, meaning upper caste males from mostly urban or semi-urban backgrounds and from middle class or upward households themselves. Middle class in India is an extremely small percentage compared to the West, please remember. So has this changed? It has changed a little bit. And a major reason why it has changed is that there is a very large amount of affirmative action and quota-driven affirmative action in India these past 50 years, 60 years. And one consequence of that has been that it has been possible, not easy, but possible for students from first-generation literates, from rural communities, and from poor households, if they have the drive to do well, to sit for national entrance tests of major institutions, to get into master's and doctoral programs, and then to go abroad as postdocs, to do well there, and to come back as faculty. I know a fair number of faculty colleagues like that. I have had my share of students who fall in that category, about which I feel good, although there's no credit to me in that. But would I say that that is a substantial change? No, it's a trickle. It's a much larger trickle than it used to be, but it's not the mainstream happening.
Any more questions? Well, let's thank Dr. Rath again for coming all the way with us.